My fiancé texted me 8 days before our wedding, saying he wasn't sure he wanted to marry me anymore. He expected me to fight for the relationship. Instead, I canceled everything, exposed the truth with one screenshot, and ended up facing him in court. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old. 8 days before my wedding, I got a text message that changed the course of my life. Not a call, not a conversation, just a text. At the time, I was sitting in my office reviewing the final catering numbers for our reception. The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday, and most of the major decisions were finally behind us. The venue was booked, the photographer was confirmed, and after weeks of chaos, even the seating chart had stopped changing. After almost 4 years together and 14 months engaged, Adrian and I were supposed to be entering the easy part. Instead, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting another vendor question or a message about wedding logistics. What I saw was this. Hey, I've been thinking a lot, and I'm not sure we should get married after all. Can we talk? I read it once, then again, then a third time. The words stayed exactly the same. At first, I thought there had to be some explanation. Maybe he'd sent it to the wrong person. Maybe one of his friends had gotten hold of his phone. Maybe another message was coming that would make the first one make sense. Nothing followed. Just those 2 sentences sitting on my screen. I remember leaning back in my chair and staring out the office window. Cars moved through the intersection below. People crossed the street carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Everything outside looked perfectly normal. Meanwhile, the future I'd spent years planning suddenly felt unstable. Looking back, the reaction that surprised me most wasn't panic or tears. It was how familiar the message felt. Deep down, I think I had been sensing something was wrong for months. Because if I was honest, the text hadn't appeared out of nowhere. For months, little things had been bothering me. Whenever we talked about the honeymoon, Adrian seemed distracted. I'd suggest destinations and he'd shrug. I'd ask what he wanted and he'd say he wasn't sure. Conversations that should have been exciting somehow became exhausting. At first, I blamed stress. Wedding planning can do that to people. But eventually, I started noticing a pattern. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was pulling away. The calls with his mother bothered me too. Every time I walked into a room while they were talking, the conversation ended almost immediately. One evening, about 2 months before the wedding, I walked into our living room carrying groceries. Adrian was on the phone with her. The moment he saw me, he lowered his voice. "Mom, I'll call you back." Then he hung up. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah. Are you sure?" He looked annoyed by the question. "Why wouldn't I be?" The answer came too quickly. At the time, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Looking back, I think I already knew something was wrong. I just wasn't ready to admit it. Because admitting it would have meant facing the possibility that the relationship I'd invested 4 years in wasn't as solid as I believed. And that's a hard thing to accept when invitations have already been mailed and family members are booking flights. The truth is, I loved Adrian. Or at least I loved the version of him I'd spent years building a future around. The man who brought me coffee in the mornings. The man who kissed my forehead before work. The man who talked about growing old together. Maybe that's why the text felt less like a surprise and more like confirmation. A confirmation I desperately didn't want. After sitting there for several minutes, I finally replied, "Of course. Let's talk in person. I'll come over tonight." His response came almost immediately. "Thank you." That was it. No explanation. No reassurance. No attempt to tell me what was actually going on. Just thank you. I set my phone down and stared at the spreadsheet open on my computer. Catering numbers, guest lists, final payments. The wedding we'd spent more than a year planning. Then a simple thought crossed my mind. If Adrian wasn't sure he wanted to marry me 8 days before the ceremony, why was I still acting like there was definitely going to be a ceremony? That question stayed with me. I sat there for a while before opening another spreadsheet, the one containing every wedding expense we'd accumulated over the past year. The spreadsheet was packed with deposits, contracts, and payment records tied to a future that suddenly felt far less certain. What bothered me wasn't the uncertainty itself. It was that after 4 years together, Adrian chose a text message instead of a conversation. If that was how he handled the biggest decision of our lives, I wasn't sure there was a wedding left to save. I picked up the phone and called the venue. The coordinator recognized my name immediately. After I explained why I was calling, she asked gently, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked at the engagement photo sitting beside my monitor. Adrian was smiling in it, so was I. For a second, it felt like I was looking at strangers. "No," I admitted, "but I think I need to." That call led to another, then another. By the end of the afternoon, I'd spoken with the venue, caterer, photographer, florist, DJ, and several other vendors. Most of them sounded shocked. A few tried to encourage me to wait. Under different circumstances, maybe I would have. If Adrian had called and said he was scared, I would have listened. If he'd told me he was struggling, I would have listened. If he'd asked for help, I would have listened. But he didn't. Instead, he told me he wasn't sure he wanted to marry me. So I took him seriously. By the time the last confirmation email arrived, the financial damage was clear. We were losing $14,600 in non-refundable deposits. Seeing the number hurt, not because it would ruin me financially, because it represented months of planning, sacrifice, and trust. That's when another realization hit me. Every payment had come from my account. Every deposit, every reservation fee, every contract. Whenever the topic came up, Adrian always had a reason for waiting. My bonus is coming next month. We'll settle up later. Keep track and I'll transfer my half. At the time, I believed him. Now I opened a fresh spreadsheet and started documenting everything. The more I reviewed the records, the more obvious something became. Every major wedding expense had come out of my account. An hour later, the final number sitting beside Adrian's name was $7,300. I checked it multiple times. The math didn't change. Neither did the facts. I printed everything, organized it into a folder, and drove to his apartment. The entire drive felt strangely calm. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was. But somewhere between the first vendor call and the last cancellation email, something inside me had shifted. I'd stopped trying to carry the relationship by myself. When I arrived, Adrian opened the door before I even knocked. The scene behind him almost would have been funny under different circumstances. Candles, soft music, a bottle of wine waiting on the counter. He'd clearly imagined a completely different evening. "Hey," he said softly. "Thanks for coming." "Sure." The answer seemed to catch him off guard. He led me to the couch and started talking almost immediately. Work had been stressful. The wedding felt overwhelming. His mother had been asking questions. Everything was moving too fast. I listened. The longer he talked, the more obvious something became. He still wasn't explaining the text. Everything was about pressure, stress, anxiety, circumstances, anything except responsibility. Finally, he looked at me and said, "I just needed reassurance." I slid the folder across the table. His sentence died halfway through. "What is this?" "Open it." The confidence disappeared from his face as he flipped through the pages. At first he looked confused, then shocked, then panicked. "What am I looking at?" "Cancellation confirmations." His head snapped up. "What?" "I canceled the wedding." For a moment, he genuinely looked like he hadn't understood the words. "You canceled everything?" "Yes." "Claire, what are you talking about?" I met his eyes. "You told me you weren't sure you wanted to marry me." I said I wasn't sure. 8 days before the wedding, that's a distinction without much difference. His mouth opened, then closed again. "You didn't even talk to me first." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I came here to talk. You sent the text before talking." That finally shut him up. His eyes dropped back to the paperwork. A few seconds later, he found the spreadsheet. The itemized breakdown. The balance, $7,300. He looked back at me. "What is this?" "Your half." And judging by the expression on his face, that was the moment he realized this wasn't going to be a conversation about saving the wedding. It was going to be a conversation about consequences. Adrian stared at the spreadsheet for several seconds before looking back at me. Then he laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from finding something funny. It sounded more like disbelief. "You're serious?" "Very." "Claire, this is insane." I almost asked which part he considered insane. The fact that I'd believed the message he sent, or the fact that I expected him to cover the half he'd agreed to pay. Instead, I let him keep talking. People often reveal more when nobody interrupts them. He flipped through the folder again, scanning receipts and cancellation confirmations, as though a different answer might magically appear if he looked hard enough. Finally, he stopped at the total, $7,300. "I'm not paying this." "That's your choice." The response caught him off guard. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not going to sit here arguing about numbers that already exist." His expression hardened. "You're acting like I did something unforgivable." I took a slow breath. "No, I'm acting like someone sent me a message saying they weren't sure they wanted to marry me 8 days before our wedding. I was scared." "Then why didn't you tell me that?" Adrian looked away. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "I thought maybe you'd remind me why we were doing this." His frustration became more obvious with every passing second. The conversation wasn't going the way he'd imagined. I could see that now. Whatever scenario he had expected probably involved tears, pleading, or some emotional discussion about fighting for our future. Instead, he was sitting across from a woman who had spent the entire afternoon canceling a wedding. He stood and began pacing. "Do you know what most couples do when somebody gets nervous?" "They talk." "Exactly." I held his gaze. That's what I wanted too. That stopped him. What? A conversation. I leaned back slightly. If you'd called me and said you were struggling, I would have listened. If you'd told me you were overwhelmed, I would have listened. If you'd said you were having doubts and wanted to work through them, I would have listened. I gestured toward his phone. But that's not what happened. He looked away. You don't understand. No, Adrian, I think I finally do. For months, I'd ignored things that bothered me because I loved him. Every awkward conversation, every strange interaction, every time he seemed less invested than I was. Looking back, I spent a lot of energy explaining away things that should have made me stop and ask questions. The problem is that when you're building a future with someone, you don't want to believe anything is wrong. You keep telling yourself it'll get better after the wedding, after work slows down, after life settles, after whatever current problem passes. But eventually the explanations run out. You're overreacting, he said. The words didn't hurt nearly as much as they would have a month earlier, mostly because they sounded familiar. Every concern became an overreaction. Every uncomfortable question became unnecessary drama. Every consequence became somebody else's fault. I stood up and picked up my purse. The conversation was over. Adrian immediately noticed. Wait, I didn't stop. Claire, you have the spreadsheet. That's not the point. His voice softened. For the first time all evening, he sounded nervous. What if I don't want this to end? I looked at him. The question would have mattered a lot more if it had come before the text, or before the cancellations, or before months of uncertainty. Instead, it arrived after all of it. Do you want to marry me? The question hung in the air. Simple. Direct. No hidden meaning. No complicated interpretation. Just a yes or no answer. And somehow he still hesitated. The pause only lasted a second, but it was enough. Enough to tell me everything I needed to know. I gave a small nod. That's what I thought. Then I walked out. He followed me into the hallway. Claire, stop. I pressed the elevator button. You're making a mistake. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. You can't throw away 4 years. That sentence would have devastated me not long ago. Now it just sounded backwards. I wasn't throwing away 4 years. I was accepting the reality that had already been placed in front of me. I looked at him one last time. You sent the text, Adrian. The doors closed. That was the last thing I said to him that night. At the time, I genuinely thought it was over. I assumed we'd sort out the remaining financial issues, tell our families the wedding was canceled, and slowly move on. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls. Every single one came from Adrian's mother, Margaret Walker. By noon, she was pounding on my apartment door. Not knocking, pounding. The kind of pounding that announces an argument before the door even opens. The second I let her in, she started talking. How dare you? No greeting. No small talk. No interest in hearing my side. Just immediate outrage. Do you have any idea what you've done to my son? That question told me everything I needed to know. Because nowhere in her opening speech was there any curiosity about why the wedding had been canceled. Only anger that it had happened. He texted me saying he wasn't sure he wanted to get married. She waved her hand dismissively. That's not what he meant. I stared at her. Then what exactly did he mean? He was nervous. Then he should have said he was nervous. He was scared. Then he should have said he was scared. He wanted reassurance. I couldn't help laughing at that. Not because it was funny. Because it explained so much. The hesitation. The mixed signals. The constant need for validation. Suddenly it all fit together. Margaret crossed her arms. He wanted to know you'd fight for him. There it was. The thing nobody had actually said out loud until now. I looked at her carefully. Are you telling me he sent that message as a test? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. And honestly, that bothered me more than the text itself. Being nervous before a wedding is normal. Sending a text like that 8 days before the ceremony isn't. Margaret, a wedding isn't a game. You don't understand. No, I understand perfectly. I pointed toward the folder sitting on my kitchen counter. Your son told me he wasn't sure he wanted to marry me. I believed him. You were supposed to fight for your relationship. I shook my head. No, we were supposed to communicate. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate response. Then her eyes landed on the folder. A minute later, she'd found the spreadsheet, and another argument began. The argument started the moment Margaret reached the last page. Her eyes locked onto the total. Then Adrian's share. Then the amount I was asking him to reimburse. $7,300? She looked at me as though I'd personally insulted her family. Absolutely not. I was already familiar with that tone. The conversation was heading exactly where I expected. He agreed to split the wedding expenses. He's the man. I blinked. I'm sorry? Men pay for weddings. The certainty in her voice almost made me laugh. Not because the statement was ridiculous, although it was, but because she'd just discovered written proof that Adrian had agreed to split everything and somehow still believed that erased it. I walked over and unlocked my phone. 6 months earlier, buried in a message thread, was the conversation we'd had when the budget first started growing. I handed her the screen. There it was, Adrian's own words. "Let's split everything 50-50 and settle up afterward." She read it. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought she might finally acknowledge reality. Instead, she changed the subject. That told me all I needed to know. People rarely change the subject when the facts are helping them. This is why relationships fail. I shook my head. No, relationships fail when people stop saying what they actually mean. Margaret snapped the folder shut. The discussion was over, at least for her. Before leaving, she stopped at the door. "You've made a terrible mistake." Then she walked out. The strange thing was that I felt lighter after she left. Not happier, not relieved, just clearer. For months, I'd been trying to understand what felt wrong. Now I was finally seeing the full picture. The uncertainty hadn't started with that text message. The text had simply exposed it. Unfortunately, clarity didn't make life quieter. 3 days later, my friend Emily called. The second I answered, I could hear something was wrong. "Claire, have you checked social media today?" My stomach sank. "No, you probably should." That wasn't encouraging. A few minutes later, she started forwarding screenshots. At first, I thought there had to be some misunderstanding. The more screenshots I opened, the worse the story became. According to Adrian's version of events, I'd canceled the wedding without warning. I'd refused to communicate. I'd abandoned him after he tried to express concerns. Some posts made it sound like he'd barely survived the experience. Others painted me as cold, heartless, and unreasonable. One comment actually called him a victim. That one almost impressed me. The man who texted his fiancée 8 days before the wedding, saying he wasn't sure he wanted to get married, had somehow become the victim. I sat on my couch, scrolling through the comments. Most annoyed me. A few made me laugh. Then I saw one that stuck with me. "A real partner would have fought harder." That seemed to be the theme everyone kept returning to. Fight harder. Fight more. Prove yourself. Earn your place. The longer I looked at those comments, the more exhausted I felt. Because none of those people knew what had actually happened. They only knew the version Adrian was feeding them. Eventually, I stopped reading. Then I opened my camera roll. The screenshot was still there. The original message. The one that started everything. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I made a decision. No long explanation. No emotional rant. No attack. I uploaded the screenshot. Added one sentence. "For anyone asking what happened, this is the conversation that led to the wedding being canceled." Then I closed the app. That was it. Within an hour, my phone exploded. Calls. Texts. Notifications. The first message came from Adrian. "Take it down." A second arrived a minute later. "Claire, seriously, take it down." Then another. "You're making me look terrible." I read all three. The irony wasn't lost on me. Apparently, the screenshot was making him look bad. Not the message itself. Not the decision to send it. The screenshot. A little later, another text appeared. "People don't understand the context." That one actually made me smile. Because context was exactly what I'd posted. Nothing more. Nothing less. I responded once. The screenshot is the context. Then I muted the conversation. Over the next 24 hours, public opinion shifted dramatically. People started asking obvious questions. If he didn't mean it, why did he send it? Why send something like that 8 days before a wedding? Why leave that part out when telling the story? The answers weren't helping Adrian. And judging by the increasingly frantic messages arriving from both him and Margaret, they knew it. A few days later, there was another knock on my door. This time I expected more drama. Maybe Margaret. Maybe another relative. Instead, I opened the door and found Robert Walker standing there, Adrian's father. Now, Robert had always been different. Quieter. Calmer. The type of man who listened more than he talked. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. "Hi, Claire." "Hi." He held up a small envelope. "Can I come in?" A few minutes later, we were sitting at my kitchen table. Robert placed the envelope between us, then pushed it toward me. I opened it. Inside was a check. $3,650. Exactly half of what Adrian still owed. I looked up. "What's this?" Robert exhaled slowly. "I went through the expenses myself." That explanation immediately made more sense. He hadn't randomly chosen the number. He'd reviewed the spreadsheet and calculated what he believed Adrian should have covered. "You don't have to do this." "I know." He gave a tired smile. "But somebody should." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "At first I was told you canceled the wedding for no reason." I nodded. "I figured." Then I saw the screenshot. His expression darkened. Robert rubbed a hand across his face. "I don't think he expected you to cancel everything." He shook his head. Honestly, I don't think he thought that far ahead. The sentence hung between us. Not because it was shocking, because it was accurate. Robert shook his head. He always needed proof. Proof people cared. Proof they weren't leaving. He stared down at the table for a moment. That might seem harmless when you're young. At some point, though, people need to learn how to say what they actually feel. I didn't argue. There wasn't much to add. A few minutes later, he stood to leave. Before reaching the door, he stopped. For what it's worth, Claire. I looked up. I think you made the right decision. Then he left. I deposited the check the next morning. At the time, I thought things were finally settling down. I had no idea the craziest part of the story was still ahead of me. About a week later, I came home from work and found legal papers taped to my apartment door. And when I read the name listed as the plaintiff, I genuinely thought it had to be a joke. Adrian was suing me. At first, I genuinely thought the paperwork had been delivered to the wrong apartment. I stood in my doorway, reading the first page once. Then again. Then a third time. The words still said the same thing. Adrian Walker was suing me. Not threatening to sue me. Not talking about it. Actually suing me. I carried the paperwork inside, dropped my bag on the kitchen counter, and sat down to read everything carefully. The further I got, the less sense it made. According to the filing, I'd caused him emotional distress by canceling the wedding. He was also demanding reimbursement for expenses he'd allegedly lost because of my actions. For a moment, I just stared at the pages. This was the same man who had texted me 8 days before our wedding, saying he wasn't sure he wanted to get married. Now he was suing me because the wedding didn't happen. The logic felt so backwards that my brain struggled to process it. The first person I called was Emily. When she answered, I skipped the greeting. Tell me if this sounds insane. 20 minutes later, she was laughing so hard she could barely speak. Please tell me you're joking. I wish I was. What exactly is he claiming? I read parts of the filing aloud. The laughter immediately stopped. Wait, he's serious? Apparently. Claire, that's unbelievable. That was one way to describe it. Another was expensive, because regardless of how ridiculous the claim sounded, it still meant I now had to deal with court. The next day, I filed a counterclaim for the remaining $3,650 Adrian still owed. At that point, it wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about facts. If we were going to put this situation in front of a judge, then the entire story was going on the record. 3 weeks later, we were sitting in a small claims courtroom. Adrian arrived with Margaret. I arrived alone. As I watched them walk in together, I realized something. Neither of them looked nervous. They looked confident, which honestly surprised me, because the central piece of evidence in the entire case was a text message Adrian himself had sent. The judge entered a few minutes later. She was an older woman with the expression of someone who had spent decades dealing with other people's bad decisions. The courtroom settled. The hearing began. For several minutes, she reviewed both claims without saying much. Then she looked directly at Adrian. Mr. Walker, did you send this message? The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Adrian shifted in his chair. Yes, but... The judge held up a hand. Did you send it? Yes. She glanced down at the document, then read part of the message aloud. I'm not sure we should get married after all. Her eyes returned to Adrian. Is that accurate? Yes. Margaret's confidence visibly faded. The judge turned toward me. Ms. Bennett, what did you do after receiving this message? I canceled the wedding. And why? Because I believed him. The answer sounded almost absurdly simple, but it was the truth. The judge nodded and continued reviewing the evidence. As the judge reviewed the payment records, vendor contracts, expense spreadsheet, and message history, the timeline became impossible to dispute. Every document pointed in exactly the same direction. At one point, Margaret tried to interrupt. The judge shut that down immediately. Ma'am, unless you're an attorney of record, you need to remain seated. Margaret sat down so fast it almost startled me. The hearing lasted less than an hour. By the end, even Adrian looked like he knew where things were heading. The ruling wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The evidence had already done all the heavy lifting. The judge dismissed Adrian's claim in its entirety. Then she addressed my counterclaim. Between the payment records, expense agreements, and outstanding balance, there wasn't much left to argue about. Her conclusion was straightforward. Adrian owed the remaining $3,650. He would also be responsible for court costs. The decision landed like a brick. Margaret looked furious. Adrian looked stunned. Neither of them said anything. As people started leaving, I gathered my paperwork and headed toward the exit. I was almost at the door when I heard my name. Claire! I turned around. Adrian was standing a few feet away. For the first time in months, he didn't look angry. He looked defeated. There was a long pause before he spoke again. Why didn't you fight for us? I stared at him. Part of me couldn't believe we were still having this conversation. After everything that had happened, After the text, after the cancellations, after the social media posts, after the lawsuit. This was still the question he wanted answered. I took a breath. You think this happened because I didn't fight for us? He didn't respond. His expression told me enough. I think it happened because you stopped talking to me honestly. Neither of us spoke after that. There wasn't much left to say. A few days later, the money arrived. Every dollar, including the court fees. The transfer notification appeared on my phone while I was eating lunch at work. I looked at it for a few seconds, then locked my screen and went back to my day. The situation that had consumed months of my life was finally over, or at least I thought it was. A week later, another message appeared. This one wasn't from Adrian. It was from Robert. The text was short. Thank you for handling this with more grace than my family deserved. I wish you the best. I sat there staring at the screen longer than I expected. Then I replied, I wish you the best too. And I meant it. Out of everyone involved, Robert had been the only person willing to accept reality without trying to rewrite it. About a month later, I boarded the honeymoon trip alone. The vacation had already been paid for and wasn't refundable. For a while, I'd considered canceling it. Then I realized there wasn't much point. The money was already spent. So I went. I leaned my head against the window and watched the clouds drift past. A few months earlier, I would have spent that entire flight wondering what I could have done differently. Instead, I found myself thinking about where I wanted to go next. The future ahead of me looked nothing like the one I'd planned. Surprisingly, that no longer scared me. When the plane disappeared into the clouds, Adrian was the last thing on my mind.